Yes. This is what we look forward to. So we're counting on you not to let us down.
All right, so I'm going to ask first couple, well, one question at least, and then but everybody else can jump in. So I'm wondering about these young narrators, you know, of Sylvie and Rachel, and thinking about the position, like what I would distinguish between something that's less literary, you know, than a literary story, the way you tell, is there's two things. One is a kind of detective story. You know, Paul Ball says all literary fiction are detective stories because it's kind of accumulation of clues. But so there's a way of trying to get to the bottom of it. But they're also sort of preserving. They're the curators of their family's history in a sense. There's this other task, sort of in the course of these books. It's trying to capture enough of a sense of the people who are lost or of a time that's lost. So I'm just wondering about the challenge of that. And also why is the age, you know, of these young women, where are they sort of the perfect, I think they are, you know, perfect people in terms of being left with their family story. It's almost as if no one will tell it unless they did, you know?
People keep asking me, like, well, as a guy in his 40s, how did you write, why did you choose to write from a teenage girl's point of view? And I'm like, in deep down, I am a teenage girl. You should all know that, 'cause it's true. But also for me, you know, I often talk about this. I lost my younger sister, died really tragically and unexpectedly when she was a teenager. But I wasn't writing about her, but my other sister, who was the age of this narrator at the time. And after my sister died, my parents divorced, my brother left home, I moved to New York to try to become a writer, and I would go home on the weekends and I did the reverse thing. I moved to New York and there were a million restaurants, but I kept my waitering job in Connecticut, in part because all my friends were there and I had great shifts and made money and like my customers, but also as an excuse to go see my younger sister who was 13 at the time. And I realized, like, toward the end of this book, I was very much channeling some essence of her at that time, because I always thought, God, she's so young to be faced with such enormous tragedy and have such an adult situation thrust upon her.
Right.
But like the character in this book, my sister always impressed me by showing such a remarkably resilient spirit and such great wisdom at such an early age, which I think many teenagers can at that age. So for me, that would be my response to the question. I don't know if it's true.
And you know, you've written from the point of view of a girl. I've written, not this one, but my novel Labor Day is also written in the voice of a boy. And I loved being a 13-year-old boy. And actually, To Die For also, I got to be a 15-year-old boy. I write that age again and again, and I'm not writing young adult when I do it. I think what I love about 13 is that it is so on the cusp. It is both child and adult. It is both and neither. And there's a kind of lack of intellectualizing. It's a 13-year-old doesn't have layers and layers of complicated strategy. So when you hear a scene described as it's seen by a 13-year-old, the 13-year-old may be deluded, but she's telling the truth.
That's right.
She's not putting on some artifice, and I love that about that age group. For me, it has not so much to do with capturing family history as point of view. I wanted to place the camera in the truest and most dependable hands. And in a way, for me, that's a 13-year-old.
Well, Joyce, I also wanted to ask about the portrait of the father, and it's such a beautiful portrait of a really complicated character, but early on in the book he's so appealing, so you feel like there's scene after scene in which he does something kind of magical but understated in a way, and you just feel, and then there's you're gonna get to the flip side of it. But just,
you have to love this guy. At least I do. You know, I've heard women, sort of stern women, say, you know, bad news. But you know, he's an irresponsible guy. You know, he takes his daughters to a double feature of James Bond, and then their mother has to deal with the fact that the 11-year-old goes home and names her cat Pussy Galore.
Right.
You know? But he's this character who brings sort of joy and fun and excitement into their lives, and tenderness too. He's a very tender father. He washes their hair, he shampoos their hair and styles their hair.
And John, I was wondering, you know, for how much of what happens did you know in advance? And I mean, there's such a feeling as you're going through of almost, you know, the scene where she walks in and there's the theater posters sort of there's this combination of sort of funny and creepy, but I'm just wondering, how the story came to you. I mean, how much did you know in advance, and how much were you just sort of watching a movie and it was getting exciting? You can't believe these things are happening. So.
I always sort of have I always feel like you just need a few big things in place, and then you kind of fill as you go. So I knew some basic things. So the parents were murdered. They had this really unusual occupation. The girls lived. They were the only house on the street. And like when I was a kid, there was this foundation up the street where a house was started and never built, and my brother and I used to go play there all the time, and I would always wonder, like, who started this home and it was just abandoned? Like, they just poured the concrete, and there was a stair to the basement, and the start of a fireplace, it was just there. And so I knew I wanted their street to have not just one, but their whole street is just that, just foundations, and then their house. So then it just increased the feeling of loneliness, and the girls played in them. So I knew just basics about their lives. And I knew that Sylvie, whoever that night in the opening scene, she was really the only witness when she went into that church, but it was dark, it was late, she just woke up, it was a million things going on, and she's 13. So I had some basic things in place, but it was sort of figuring it out as I went. And then 2/3 of the way through, I guess I would say, I had it all put together, but because it was like telling two books at once, the past story of their lives and then what happened months afterwards, sometimes I would just have to like lay on the floor and stare at the ceiling. Like, it made my head hurt sometimes. I don't know. It was a lot to put together, the whole thing. But, yeah.
I know writers that I respect enormously who plan everything out and know exactly where the story's going. That's not me, and it never has been for any novel I've written. What I see myself doing is setting characters into motion who I hope are so believable and real and human that they will tell me what they're going to do. It's actually a lot like parenthood. You give birth to this child, you have the illusion briefly, you may still be harboring this illusion with a 5-year-old that you are in charge of where they're going. But
I don't have that illusion.
it doesn't last long. It's the honeymoon ends, and thank God it does. I mean, unless you have a mother or a father who is too imposing of his or her own direction. So I set them into motion, and then I wait to see, and they tell me the story. I know it's why I tend to write very fast, because I can't wait to see how the book is going to turn out. This book took longer than any book I've ever written because of some complexities in plot, but I knew absolutely what kind of people they were and the sort of thing that they would do. It was clear that this girl would try to catch the killer, and it was clear that this father would feel failed and crushed by his inability to be the man that he perceived himself always to be.
One of the magical things, Joyce, is these two sisters, they're who don't have cable, they go around and look into other people's windows and watch TV. And
actually, I should say this both it comes from the real experience of these girls who grew up very poor in Nevada, and who didn't have TV and used to look in picture windows. But it also touches on a theme that runs through my books to a sort of eerie degree, which is people looking through windows at somebody's seemingly perfect life. And it actually is very much about television, because I was a girl, back to that alcoholic family that shaped me so much, who kept on, this is, for the people who, are about 59 years old in this group, the TV shows that we were all watching of those perfect-looking families, and I sure didn't live in one. And I would look in and sort of imagine what life was like in that perfect world. And these sisters have a kind of double remove. They look through the picture window at a woman looking at TV that is showing what? The Brady Bunch. And they are double removed from the perfect life.
And I love that they come up with dark scenarios for the Brady Bunch.
Much more
I always thought of too, these two families, isn't someone going to fool around?
I was a 13-year-old obsessed with sex, and I gave that to my 13-year-old girl.
All right, so one more question for me, and then we'll turn it over. And John, I just wanted to ask, how your sort of experience with the paranormal in terms of writing about it and sort of dropping a kind of resistance to it and sort of being open. I mean, I think in all your books, the fact that you are open-minded to things that other people might make fun of, I think, is part of the lifeblood of why it works. But there must be a step in which you say, okay, I'm just going to look at this weird website. I'm just going to go to this place and be open to it. So.
Well, it's like well, here's the thing with the book is there are all those books where suddenly someone sprouts fangs or wings or is moving things with their mind. And there's nothing wrong with those books, but for me, that territory's been so well tread that as soon as something like that happens in fiction or movie, it's almost less scary. You're like, oh, okay, I know what this is. I've been here before. So I think it's much more scary to kind of tiptoe up to the edge of what's possible and believable in terms of the paranormal, and then let the reader's mind fill it in. In this book, there's this scary Raggedy Ann doll that the parents keep in a cage in the basement. I don't need to do anything else. That's enough, and it scares the crap out of people. And what's funny is like people now keep tweeting me and emailing me pictures of their Raggedy Ann doll. So like I'll turn on my cell and like,
My long lost brother. You know, I have an Emmett Kelly puppet.
Oh my gosh.
In my book that it accomplishes the same.
That's so funny. Well, the funny thing is, a few years ago, I was up in my mom's attic, and I was looking for something, and I opened a garbage bag, and there was like a bunch of red yarn. I was like, "What is this?" And I pulled it out, and it was attached to this toddler-sized Raggedy Ann doll. After I screamed and pissed my pants, I was like, and this doll just stayed on my mind. I had like how scary it was up in the attic, and then I just had this idea to like just put it there. So, I don't know with the paranormal stuff, like. Ultimately, I want so much to believe, and that's Sylvie's thing, is she wants to believe. Logically, she doesn't. I think a lot of us feel this way. Logically, we don't. But then life serves up some inexplicable experience, and you can't help but believe again. And that's oftentimes the balance I find myself on, and a lot of the characters in my book, Strange But True, which is sort of an outlandish plot at the start, but is very much about belief in these strange but true situation. And the same with Help for the Haunted.
Well, let's turn it over to some questions from the audience.
Hi.
Hi.
I was going to ask actually how you stylistically decided to use the doll, because so you kind of answered some of that, but without any spoilers. It seemed like you had a lot of tools like that that didn't actually do anything but were really, really, really creepy, like the doll and like even the movie theater. You know what I mean? Things. That it was almost as if the fear of was worse.
Yeah. And well, I guess that's what I wanted, was just to put these things in, and you know the history, because the parents are these quote unquote famous demonologists, and so they tell you what the hatchet was once that's in the basement was once used in this mass
all your
killing.
stuff in the basement is scary.
Yeah, but also there's like the father's old dental chair down there, like a dental chair in a basement, and dental equipment in a basement. It's just creepy. I went a little creepy this time, everybody, even more creepy than in the previous books. But I don't know, somehow just planting it there and letting the reader's mind fill in seems scarier to me than if the doll or the dental equipment came to life and started chasing Sylvie around. It was just the mere presence of it. And then some things do happen, and the reader's left to question what the reality of the situation is, and again, I find that scarier.
I have a question for each of you. How did you cope with your titles?
You know, I struggle with titles, and I had a lot before this one. I put it up to my Facebook readers, in fact. Yes. The alternative title at the end was The Little Sister, and overwhelmingly, Facebook readers said After Her.
After Her's great.
They were right.
It's a great
Yeah,
title.
yeah.
I had another title all along, and it just wasn't working. And then at the end, you know, the father talks about how he placed an ad in the paper when they first started their business, Help for the Haunted, and it's just an ad offering their services. And at some point I thought, and then someone writes a book about them, the parents using that title, Help for the Haunted, and at some point I called Joanna, my lovely agent who's here, and I said, what do you think of that title? And she really liked it, and then we had been through so many titles at that point, it was like, it's probably when you like date a million people you can't judge like anymore, you've lost your mind. So we're like, let's just sit with it for a little bit. And then we both like a week later we're like, I still like it, do you? And then we both still did, and so that's how it stuck. And I actually really personally love the title, so I'm happy that we stuck with it. So.
Yeah. Right there.
Yeah, I'm only about a third of the way through, so don't give me spoiler alerts
Okay.
here. You know, I thought it was interesting. I hadn't seen anyone since my grandmother who was so religious yet so part of the occult at the same time. How did you think to put those characters together and kind of tread that line?
Well, it's funny, like I said, when I used to go to the library all the time, I taught myself to read tarot cards, and then years later, Anne had retaught me how to read them, but I was always interested in that sort of occult stuff. And as a matter of fact, an aside, when I started dating my boyfriend, I remember people would call in the middle of the night to get tarot readings from me, and I'd like turn on the light, and I'd be like, hold on. They'd be like, is he gonna leave his husband for me? I'd be like, hold on. And he Thomas was like, am I dating a fortune teller? What's going on here? And he was like, forbid it, because he's so religious. And so I think I've known people who've been so religious, but yet at the same time, all that stuff can be really entwined, because if you're dealing with the possessed, you know, it is a religious function, but yet there is all that other paranormal stuff, so they are combined. And I just saw that that's how the parents were, and that's how they came out. So.
You had a question.
Go ahead. Questions for Joyce. Hi. It's a process question, and it alludes to kind of what you've been saying in your talk today about not planning that much. And I didn't realize that you like to do the audio versions of your book, which makes perfect sense. To what degree, as you're writing, are you primarily kind of embodying your characters as you go, almost to the point where, do you read it out loud?
I do. I'm a very oral, A-U-R-A-L writer, and I think actually for anybody in this space who writes, it's one of the most valuable things you can do, to read your work out loud. But I want to hear it. I often move, because it's a frustratingly unphysical act to sit at a laptop read. So I act out scenes, I move around the room, I imagine what position people are in, and I become that person. I had once the very disconcerting experience of having committed to write a book that was about terrible people, and and terrible people then inhabited my brain for a year and a half. I hated it. I'll never do that again. I like to write about flawed people with big issues, or there'd be no story. But I want to find something to love, and I want to locate the heart in every character, and then I am that person for a while. I miss them when it's over. There's always a man I fall in love with. In Labor Day, it was the convict on the run. At this time, it was the cheating Italian American cop father. And then I go back to my life, which I like very much, but I miss those people. They're gone.
I have one quick question, which is, in both these books, there are long sections of adrenaline rush, and I'm wondering, is it like spice with food, that once you get it, it's hard to go back to anything else? Like once you have the experience of writing something that has a reader at the end, just pumped in that way, the sort of thrill of telling a story with that much tension, whether you can quiet your stories down, at some point. I think the answer is you can, but I'm wondering whether there's something that's addictive about writing something that's that exciting to read.
I wrote a book in graduate school that I sent to a friend of a friend of a friend who was an editor at a publishing house, who said, you don't need an agent, just send it. And I sent it to her, and I got back the manuscript, and it had a very polite form letter, not really formally, 2 steps away from the form letter, dear Mr. Searles, thanks for sending it, I didn't relate as much as I wanted to, best of luck. Then I pulled the manuscript out, and this little scrap of paper fell to the floor, and it was a handwritten note, clearly meant just in-house, it was not meant to be included, and it said I could barely make it to page 60, and I feel really sorry for anyone who has to read the whole thing. I was very Downton Abbey about it. I took to my bed. I was like, I'll never write again. But weirdly, that broke my heart at the time, but it was as a writer, something really great happened to me, because I think I was in graduate school, I was figuring out how to write, and maybe I was being self-indulgent and not thinking about the other person on the other side of the transmission, and so transmission, is the word? What the message you're sending. And so I now always keep the reader in mind, and I try to create questions from the very start. In this case, actually in Stranger Between Voice and Help for the Haunted, I start both with a late night phone call, so I guess I can't do that again, but I've used my quota for that. But what more alarming thing is there than a late night phone call? Because we've all had the experience where your phone rings at 2 in the morning or whatever time, and you're like, who's dead, what's happened, what's wrong? And so from the start, I try to create things that will make the reader want to keep turning, and I try to dole out those questions. So to answer your question, ever since that letter that I got, I've always tried to keep a little bit of adrenaline pumping in the books.
But I think we need both. I mean, if it was relentless
Yeah.
tension and high volume, then we need to catch our breath. There's a place in the novel where we've just been at the sort of the height of the tension for my two girls, and the narrator pulls back and for about 5 pages offers a meditation on the nature of 13-year-old girls.
Yeah.
And I think that we sort of need to catch our breath. You know, if everything was top volume, we wouldn't appreciate the top volume. I have to say that while I was writing this book, I rediscovered television. I had been a TV obsessed person, and then I had no use for television for 40 years, and I was watching Breaking Bad a lot, which I actually consider literature of our times, and I do think that our reading tastes and our lives as readers are shaped by what era we're living in. We are now in the era of Breaking Bad and Homeland and Downton Abbey, and this was a very Breaking Bad influenced storytelling. I know I was conscious of that kind of pace and character. I mean, I don't think I've just come back from 2 world-class film festivals, Telluride and Toronto, where I saw extraordinary movies. Partly because the Labor Day movie was there, but there was nothing to equal that show. Or at least nothing to surpass that show.
Yeah, I have a question for you both. I mean, you're Breaking Bad fan too. But regarding your stories and the setting, John, you had mentioned that the Tudor house that you stayed in became the girls' house, and in your story, it takes place on Mount Tam, which is near where you live. Do you feel it's necessary for you to have lived in a place in order to write about it, to really capture the essence, or can you at times completely make up the details of the place that you have?
I think it depends. There are places that I've completely made up from whole cloth in my imagination, and that's fun too. And then sometimes you are inspired by a place where you are, or where you're living, or where you've been, or where you stay. And sometimes the hardest work of writing for me is like painting the room. Like that takes the hardest room, like the descriptive detail. And when you don't have to imagine it because you have it right there to borrow from, that makes your job a little bit easier for me anyway.
This is the first, I grew up in New Hampshire, and I spent the first 42 years of my life in the state of New Hampshire, and all of my fiction was very small town New England located. And I moved to California 17 years ago, and this is the first time that I felt I was really ready to locate a work of fiction in the place where I live, because I finally felt I inhabit it enough. So for me, I need to sort of go out and breathe the air and touch there's a crucial spot. I needed to have a place on Mount Tamalpais where things were going to converge. Because to just say, a rock, a manzanita tree isn't going to do it. And I actually found my place with a real spot on Mount Tam. I've hiked a lot on the mountain, and there is, in this very mysterious place, in the middle of a field in the mountain, going down from the top down towards Stinson Beach, there is a truck body. There is it's nowhere near a road, and it's been there for a very, very long time. And I always, it was a mystery. I mean, I think, we all are sort of drawn to, solving why were those foundations never built. I always thought about that truck body and imagined, who died in the whatever accident it was that brought it down there. And that did become the place where everything came together in my story.
I bet you the guy who wrote The Haunted Vagina, he probably knew that.
And sometimes it's just a little trick that you play with yourself. You wouldn't have to, but you have to, just to get you going, you imagine a spot.
All right, well, to leave time for you guys for book signings, maybe we should end with A Haunted Vagina.
That's where we started.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.